All right, welcome to a brand new episode of Generative AI and I. I'm Ranjani Mani. Now, generative AI, I think it's been compared to the mosaic moment, the iPhone moment. It's one that has disrupted the way we look at technology over the last few months now. And it's bringing in every single day, Aniket, every time I look into my feed, and there's this stuff which comes in terms of new business model, new applications. There's a huge way of change which is happening. So, this podcast is intended to help you understand how generative AI will impact the future of tech from the leaders who are actually building and looking at the space. What does the market landscape look like? The new applications and use cases it will spawn, and the risks and hurdles we will have to tackle together. So, this is a 10 and 30 podcast, which means 10 questions, 30 minutes, and with the goal to help you understand and be ahead in this new machine generated creative new world. Please know that all the opinions shared here are personal. So, with that, we get into today's episode. Today, we're going to chat with Aniketh, who's a VC at Ideaspring Capital. He has an MBA from Oxford. He comes with a rich background in tech, with a global experience working across US, Singapore, and India. He's contributed to growth of three startups, again, across stages. Um, he's been with four venture capital firms, a family office, and a global investment bank. He currently, as a VC, invests in companies building tech product solutions for the enterprise space. Who better to talk about the space than a person who's closely looking into it? Thank you for being with us today, Ankit.
My pleasure, Ranjani. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Awesome. So, quite excited to get started with you, Aniket. So, before we get into the details, right? I'm very curious. What inspired you to pursue a career, or why are you interested in the space, right? And how has your journey been so far, looking into the generative AI space?
So, for me, it happened very much by chance. So, I work in a venture capital firm that looks to invest in cutting edge technology, more so on the B2B side. And part and parcel of my job is to keep abreast of what's happening latest in the world of tech. And I think I probably came on to the generative AI bandwagon much later than when the buzzword all began. So, I think I came across at the term was coined officially in the year 2014, but I don't think I
Mm,
had any inkling of what the phrase or the word was until 2021, 2022. Uh,
mm,
for me personally, I came across, or my job requires me to speak to startups and invest in companies that I believe
mhm,
have a future potential. And I came across a startup in the video creation space. It was
uh-huh,
artificially creating videos, or at that point in time, it was called synthetic videos, which is, I would say, a precursor to generative videos. And when I came
mhm,
across the technology and saw what the company was looking to do with that technology, that got me excited about the space. And from then on, it's been an evolving journey, and I've come across many other startups in this space. So
mm.
yeah, that's largely been my foray into the world of generative AI.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You're like in the thick of things, right? Like most of us are probably consuming this as more as news, but you're actually right in the middle of it. So maybe for those who are unfamiliar with the term or even ambiguous about what it actually means, um, can you explain what generative AI is and how do you think it differs from other types of artificial intelligence?
Sure. So, generative AI is a derivative of artificial intelligence, and the idea is to create new data. It could be in the form of images, text, video, music, anything of that sort. Actually, data itself. Where you're analyzing and processing existing data, it uses deep learning algorithms to uh, uh, and neural networks to learn patterns in the existing data to then artificially create new content that has previously never ever existed. While this might sound like what AI was about all this while, I think the key differentiation between this and other forms of AI is that AI was previously uh, just capable of what do you call it, analyzing and analyzing and classifying existing data, but there was no element of new data being created. So I think I can give you an example from the world of chatbots, which we've all seen when we interact with our uh, with with a commonly used consumer facing app. So
Hmm.
chatbots, for instance, so when you have a when you have a request to make of a company, say you have received your parcel late or don't know when it is coming, you typically type in something into what is now a artificial chatbot, and you get a response from the other side. Now, a chatbot will give you responses basis the text that you have input, and the scope for it to go above and beyond that is minimal. And I think a lot of time that leaves the customer frustrated as well, because you keep getting the same standard responses that doesn't really answer the question. Whereas generative AI infused into a chatbot would mean that the system at their end is actually understanding the language that you are typing in or you're communicating in, and will accordingly keep sort of tailor making the response to get better and better at answering the question that you have. So ultimately, the user or the customer at our side, or we as customers, shouldn't be able to differentiate between a human response and a computer generated response, and that's what generative AI is looking to bridge.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it out that way, right? Like mimicking human behavior. Because, yes, this is a space which fascinates me as well, Aniketh. And I remember reading about this, right, in terms of all of this while most of our work with AI has been discriminative, right? Like you keep saying, okay, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is how you're treating it. And then you're saying, okay, this is a new picture. Yes, this is a cat. Or you say, all right, I've seen these kind of movies, so therefore, these are the kind of movies which you would probably like. So it's been that way versus what we are doing now in terms of actually generating data, right, and creating output, which has never been a space has focused earlier in AI, right? So I think that's hugely changed the way we look at things. And like you rightly called out, it's seeking to mimic human behavior in itself, right? There's a lot of questions I have in terms of what does it really imply, right? How is it going to change? And maybe touch upon the focus people have in terms of will I lose my job, right? That seems to be the focus most people tend to have, and we'll kind of get there, right? But uh, in terms of different aspects, you mentioned that you started with understanding video creation, and you spoke to startups in synthetic video creation space. I'm very curious about what are the other areas in generative AI that you find fascinating. Where do you see value accruing in the future?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think video or the media industry was my first sort of foray into what this technology is capable of. But and I think that by itself is a large sector. I mean, I think the way media is, I think creation of video has largely been in the hands of a few people previously. I think what generative AI is capable of doing is democratize the creation process and allow everybody to be able to create something that's of a quality that can be consumed. And we all know that consumption through video is far more effective than, say, audio or text. So media is one industry where I think there's huge scope for disruption. But I think even some of the other sectors like healthcare, finance, education are good examples of areas that I think will see the effect of what generative AI is capable of disrupting. Uh, Healthcare, for instance, generative AI can be used to help diagnose and treat diseases, help in the whole drug discovery process by trying out or synthesizing new combinations of molecules. On the finance side, I think generative AI can be used to analyze financial data and make predictions about market trends, and also can help a lot in the detection of fraudulent activities as well. I think even in education, we have all been used to one size fits all education. I think generative AI can be used more for personalized education. I think as more and more uh, intuitive tools are created or applications are built where the system sort of understands what exactly is the need of a certain individual, I think education can also be tailor made and be more useful to the end user. I think these are some of the interesting areas that I believe will be disrupted in the times to come.
Yeah, it pretty much spans the entire gamut of industries that way, right? Maybe to different extents, but across. You mentioned personalized education, and I remember reading probably an interview around Khan Academy, around how every single individual, every single student could have their own AI tutor. And I have like an 8-year-old Aniketh, right? And it's so interesting to see that, think about explaining concepts which are complex, like quantum computing, to an 8-year-old, right? Which is now so feasible. And children, unlike us, take to technology much easier than we do, right? There's not a lot of unlearning to do. So it's fascinating to see this just happening and unfolding in front of us. So very
Yeah.
related to that question, right? You spoke about the different sectors and spaces where there are use cases feasible, all the way from healthcare, finances to ed tech. And 5 years seems to be a big time, long time, right? Given the pace at which this is moving. But then if you had to forecast, where do you think, which areas do you think would grow the fastest? How do you think this will pan out?
I think in the way the technology itself is evolving, I think when Chat GPT was made available to all of us to use, and we were all blown away by what it was capable of.
Mhm.
Before I think a lot of us even got the handle of how it works. I think we already heard of the next language model that was being used to power it, and that was then integrated into search. And I think Microsoft, for instance, is now thinking of integrating it with all of their enterprise products as well. So I think the pace at which things are growing, a 5 year horizon is, to be totally honest, very very long in terms of figuring out
Yeah,
what it will look like. I would say even predicting what's going to happen a year down the line is very difficult. And I think as a venture capitalist as well that has to invest in the area, we are actually at a point right
yeah,
now where uh, we don't know if what we invest in today will become redundant or won't be state of the art 3 months down the line. So
yeah,
we are also sort of waiting and watching. But I think to answer your question in specific, I think areas that even from a technology standpoint will definitely get better is, I think there's a lot of focus to ensure that uh, the language itself is getting better and better. So the quality of language generation models is only going to improve significantly as the models get better and better at understanding context and get better at understanding human sentiments, and can accordingly sort of generate better and better output. I think in terms of creativity, like I touched upon it earlier, I think creativity is something that you either thought you had it or you didn't, and a lot of creative works were created by very few people. I think today, even if you are a bad singer and are
mm,
embarrassed to sing in the are embarrassed to sing or create music,
mm,
you could create a piece of music here that nobody has ever heard before. You could understand trends. You could figure that the latest uh, hip hop tunes or EDM tracks are what people like. I can merge that with the voice of somebody that I know wouldn't sing
mm,
in that particular style and create a new song that could actually appeal to the masses. Something that you couldn't have done previously, even if you knew what music composition meant, but if you didn't have the tools or the innate physical skills to do it yourself. So I think those are some things that I think will will sort of completely change the way things are created. I think even on going back to one more example on the media side, I think advertisements are again something that have always been uh, you need to sort of accept what is given to you even if it is not
yeah,
relevant to you. I think through internet advertising that has improved, but I think even TV ads are getting better and better. I mean, I came across a startup that uh,
mm,
uh, that helps just purely from a cart abandonment standpoint. A lot of e-commerce
mm,
sites, for instance,
mm,
have this problem of customer conversion not being great. People
yeah,
browse items, add an item to their shopping cart, and then just take the or just move away from the decision making part of it to purchase. So
mm,
this company will at that point in time send you a video message from, say, a Shah Rukh Khan, and will tell you that, hey Ranjini, I saw you ordered this item. I think it's very good. Actually, if you place an order right now, I will ensure that you get a 10% or a 20% discount, which can
mm,
actually improve call to action considerably. I think something like that, uh, you would you would appreciate a message like that coming your way. And more importantly, the creation of a message like that is not more effort from their end if you use technology in the right way. So I think these are some of the interesting areas that immediately I think can have potential. 5 years, like I said, is too long a horizon, and I don't know what
mm.
else will come about, but it's exciting for sure.
Yeah, it is. I have a couple of follow-ups to that, right? First of all, I completely agree with your point around how quickly this is changing, right? Starting from the LLMs to, I think every single day there's this fear of missing out I have in terms of, oh, what's happening today? What did I miss out, right? I think day for yesterday or maybe last week we had this news around auto GPTs, and there was this really nice demo around how the entire process could be automated without intervention, right? Like just going and parsing through Amazon, picking up the prices, putting it into a file, and all of that done without like any kind of completely autonomously in itself, right, through the agent. So I can think of like 10 different things which we can do with that entire end-to-end automated. So just moving at such a rapid pace. So I completely get your point around how this might change. My question was with respect to like the examples you called out, right? I've been talking to a lot of startups, and they have this focus on avatar creation, using videos for L&D, employee engagement, and like you called out for marketing. And even as you get more and more of these coming up, as an investor, I'm curious about how do you see them building a flywheel? Where do you see them building stickiness and engagement with the customer? Because a lot of this is quite replicable that way, and it's also rapidly changing, evolving. So when you think about it in terms of investments and, oh, is this something which would sustain? How do you evaluate it, especially in a space which is as easily replicable without as much stickiness as it could be in other sectors?
Sure. That's a great question. So I think the way I look at it is, I think when we saw technology in the whole generative AI space and what it was capable of doing, a lot of us were fascinated by the breadth of scope the technology had. So, just to give you
Mm,
an example, a company that pitched to us uh, in a certain use, they pitched to us with the technology being applicable in a certain use case. And one of
mm,
the first exercises that we did that was an eye opener for me itself was take that technology and actually put it out on a drawing board and see where
mm,
all it could be used. And I
mm,
figured that, or at least the exercise, and I was just doing it basis first principle. I had no idea
mm,
whether there'd actually be a demand for it, but I was just, it was a creative exercise for me to
mm,
just say, okay, this is what the technology is capable of doing. Now, which sectors can it affect and in what way? And
mm,
after that, I actually picked one particular sector, I think, or two sectors. I think I picked the uh, banking and financial services space and the e-commerce industry, and just wanted to look at this technology being utilized in that. And these aren't ideas that the company had pitched to me in the first case. And
mm.
by that itself, I could figure that there were 8 or 9 different things that the technology could be used. And I pitched that. So I sort of reverse pitched back to the company and I said
Right.
that, hey, have you
Mm,
thought of these use cases? And
mm,
they hadn't, or some of them they had, some of them they hadn't,
mm.
which got me excited about the potential to dig deep within a particular
Right.
sector or a function. So to answer
Right.
your question, how does it create that flywheel for continuous growth? I think the value creation, I think we've all now, we're all, or most of us are convinced that the technology can stand on its own legs and has potential. I think now the scope of companies looking to build and create in this space should be to dig deep into a particular vertical. And for that, you need to have a very, very strong understanding of problems in a particular sector, problem
Mm,
statements that you want to go after, and how the
mm.
solution is sort of zeroing on exactly solving that problem. I think a
Right.
lot of value can be created on that front, because then you can also uh, build teams accordingly. So, for instance, if a company said, "Hey, I have this technology, I'll sell it to healthcare, I'll sell it to BFSI, I'll sell it to education,
Right.
I'll sell it to direct, I'll sell it to end customers, and I'll sell it to enterprises." Now, that
Mm.
sounds appealing, but the practicality of executing on
Yeah.
all of that with a limited budget and to do so in a quick amount of time is very less. I mean, just take a
Right.
simple problem of sales for that company. The company
Right.
will have to hire specialists in sales who know how to sell to each of those sectors. That's going to
Yep.
be an expensive process. So
Mm.
would you hire a VP of sales who knows how to sell to banks? Will you hire a VP of sales who knows how to sell to hospitals, and
Mm.
offer each of these respective areas a half
Mm.
ready solution? Or do you want to pick one particular sector, dig deep, get to 70-80% of or show your competence to the point where 70-80% of the use cases that they have, your solution can cater to it? And that answers that word that you said as well, in
Mm.
terms of creating stickiness. I think stickiness within that client will then be established, stickiness within
Mm.
that sector will then be established, and then move on to adjacent sectors, and you yourself will have the revenue coming in from one line to help fund potentially your foray into other sectors as well. To me, that I
Yeah.
think is the approach. So as we are also
Absolutely.
looking at new startups in the space or companies in the space, we want to we're more or less testing how deep they can get into it, because that gives us the confidence that they understand one sector inside out, rather than just sort of having a bird's eye view of everything.
I think that's a very astute observation, right? In terms of going deeper versus broader. I know it's very appealing, like you rightly called out, that let's cater to all of them because everyone has use cases around, say, synthetic video. But are you actually solving a particular problem for a particular domain? And what makes you invaluable versus another person is probably the depth of expertise, right? So I quite like that. Talking about depth and width, the other area which I've been contemplating myself, I've heard a couple of others also talk about this, Aniket, is uh, how do you think this will fare between incumbents and new players? And maybe I'll contextualize this a bit, right? When I talk about incumbents, I'm probably talking about people who are across the stack, right? In terms of playing at the infra layer, models in terms of creating their LLMs, and the application layer as well. And then there are newer players who are probably very domain specific. They are looking at, okay, conversational editing or within healthcare, and they are probably at the application layer itself. Now, I understand compute is expensive, and that's not a space which everyone could and should also play. But then at the same time, playing at the application layer alone may or may not necessarily provide the amount of differentiation which will allow you to scale and sustain, right? So that trade off in terms of incumbents versus new players, I'm trying to understand if there's like a sweet spot. How do you think they would play with each other? Where do you think, again, it's an evolving market, but I'm curious to understand how you're looking at it, right?
Sure. So I think, see, we as I'll give it to you from the context of our fund, and our fund looks to our investment fund sort of looks to invest in companies where something is unique from a technology standpoint. The technology has a certain IP that's hard to replicate,
Mm,
and we like companies like that. So even if a company has little or no business traction, but the
mm,
technology is something that's valuable, we can invest in it. Now in this particular space, in so when I have to use our funds logic with what we see in generative I think there's a lot of money being spent at the infra or at the base layer
mm,
stage to create
mm,
the models. Now
mm,
I think for a new company to create a mark in that space might be difficult if you don't have the right team, if you don't have the right access to funding, because there's so much money being pumped in by the big
yeah.
tech companies that I feel a smarter decision from the standpoint, or if you have a limited budget but still want to are optimistic about the space, a smarter division might be to stay away from that and actually
Mm,
focus more on the application layer, which then gets
mm,
to the point that you mentioned, which is it's hard to show what's truly unique about your space,
mm,
about what you are building in the application layer, because technology might not be a big differentiator, but I think that's where business model differentiation can often go sort of unnoticed, and you could come up with innovative business models. You could show quick traction, and I think if you can show the ability to grow quickly by acquiring customers, the head start that you have can be your competitive moat from other companies that are coming up in that space. I also look at it as I mean, I also when we evaluate a company, a common thing we need to, or two things that we need to keep in mind from a competition standpoint: will a new player come into this space, or will one of the existing big players also look to get into this space?
Mm,
The
mm,
new pla- the latter to that, will new players come in? I think I just answered that when I said that I think if you have differentiation even from a business model standpoint, and you're agile in terms of getting traction quickly, you can create some sort of a moat. I think the big players or the big tech companies, in my, you used a nice analogy in the beginning of it being the iPhone moment.
mm,
I have another analogy here in terms of whether big tech companies will get into it. So I look at it more as, or I look at it like the whole App Store and the Play Store
mm,
analogy here. So I
mm,
would think the big tech players are the ones creating a platform like the App Store or the Play Store, and
mm,
the applications that are eventually built on it, some will be free, some will be paid for. But I don't think the big tech players, at least today, will want to zero in on particular use cases
yeah,
and invest time, effort, money into that.
yeah,
They have the ability to do so, but I would
mm,
think they would look to monetize the pipelines instead. So get a piece of or license out or provide their API integrations with things like OpenAI, etc., and make money out of that today, and see which are
mm,
the areas where the sector is really picking up, and maybe down the line they will also look to get into a particular sector in a deep way. Whereas I think new companies that are coming up will largely operate in that space of wanting to create something new there. So I'm not talking about creating the next $1 trillion enterprise, but I think there's a lot of value to be created, or a lot of value on the table, even by creating 10 to $100 million enterprises, which I think companies should look
mm,
at. And I think, even a fund like that, that's our thesis. I mean, while it's
mm,
great to identify the next unicorn, I think there's a
mm,
lot of money and value on the table even at a level below that. And
mm.
if you can tap into that, uh, you could you could really sort of create a lot of value and do good for yourself.
Yeah. Uh, I quite like that. It's quite close to the way I think about how this is evolving as well. And the TLDR I'm hearing from you is there is space for both, right? Both kind of business models to coexist, and it would in the near future at least, right? So, kind of switching the tracks a bit, I want to talk about regulation, Aniket. Like this is moving at such a rapid pace, and there's questions around morality, ethics, regulation. Recently, I think Sam Altman gave this interview around calling out how, given how new the space is, he would rather build in public, right? Let folks come along on their journey and help understand and provide feedback, which is what he's probably been doing over the last two, three versions of products from OpenAI, right? Um, while that's probably feasible for him as a much smaller company as versus the corporate giants we have. Um, this is a new space altogether for all of us, right? There are articles every day about AI hallucinating, which is probably the best case scenario. But in the worst case scenario, you have examples of like voice cloning, scams which are popping up around how people are getting scammed because someone who sounds like their relative calls them and asks them for money. These are like
Yeah,
completely new things which people probably not in this space are even unaware of, right? So there's a lot of questions around how governments are tackling it. Everyone is trying to do it in a different way. I want to get your inputs on this, right? Like, where do you see most serious ethical regulatory concerns, and how do you think it should be addressed? Again, I understand it's a very generic, broad question, but very curious to understand how you're thinking about it as an investor and an individual.
sure. So I think few points there. So one is, I think from the aspect of bias and discrimination, I think one needs to understand how new information or data or content is being created in the space. It is, after all, being trained on a certain set of data and then iterating on top of that. So the base data that's being used for training the existing models, if that itself isn't representative of a larger of a more realistic picture of what's out there, I think there could be bias and discrimination in the content being created by generative AI. I think to address this specifically, data scientists, machine learning engineers must be conscious of the data that they use, and they should try and ensure that there is a larger sort of representative set basis which models are being trained. And accordingly, I mean, corrections can be made along the way. I think the other aspect in terms of ethics or morality which needs to be considered is in terms of who owns a lot of this content or the
Mhm.
intellectual property around it. So I think it's possible that uh, take a lot of these image generators that are there. I mean, you could feed in an image of the Mona Lisa and tweak it and then call that your own artwork,
Right.
but feeding in that image, who is actually policing the fact that what is being fed into the system is actually sourced legally, correctly, etc. So I think again the scope for regulation there to ensure that uh, what do you call it? Training models can only sort of work on open source or publicly licensed data. I think that's one way, and also the end product that is created. I think rules need to be written about who owns it. Are there possibilities for revenue sharing agreements if that's going to be eventually monetized? Will some money go back to the original creator? I think that's again an area that could really heat up and boil up if people don't give due thought and consideration to what's happening there. Uh, and I think the last aspect that I can think of is, I think like you mentioned, like the audio cloning, etc. I think there's a lot of scope for misuse and malicious use of this data. I mean, today also a lot of the authentication that is done for me as a customer in different, like
Mm,
my bank, for instance, if I'm making a high value transaction, I get a
mm,
call and I'm asked to answer questions on the phone, and post which they will approve the transaction. But like you
mm.
said, I mean, my voice could now very easily be cloned. My signature, I'm sure, can be very easily be uh, uh, can be sort of faked again. My video, I know I can. My face can be morphed. My lips could be. My lip syncing could be perfectly done with that audio cloning happening. For even if me to even if I have to send a video to someone, like you said, asking for money, etc., it may not actually be me, but it could very well be me. So I think even drawing the line of what is real content versus, let's call it, synthetically created content, I think if people are more aware that that both these options exist and take a decision basis either. I mean, we've spoken about all the positives of synthetic data, and I'm not saying, or of generated data, and I'm not saying it's and while all of these negatives do exist as well, I would say as long as a clear demarcation between the two, and people are using it with the right intent of not trying to fool the other person, I think there is scope for both to exist in parallel. But yeah, you're right. I think there's a lot of policy and regulatory work that needs to go in as and when these a lot of these use cases get formalized and get better and better.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of this is not stuff you can plan for, right? It's stuff you understand and uncover as you proceed and develop further. I want to add a couple of points here, right? One, I think a lot of large corporates are also looking at it in terms of responsible AI. How do you introduce safety and control as you build new LLMs and applications? Um, I remember watching this video. Probably it was Sam Altman or someone from AI who spoke about how compared to the previous versions, now I think there is much better control in terms of addressing things which could be hazard, right? Like how do I make a potentially hazardous bomb, which could have been responded earlier, but it wouldn't right now. They're bringing in humans in the loop through reinforcement learning. And these are things which over time will continue to improve. Again, having said that, it's definitely not to say that, oh, there's no risks that exist. It still does, right? And huge amount of risk that exists. And it
Yeah.
needs to be a combination of the humans, the corporates, and the policymakers as well, right? Kind of coming together in order to um, define what the future should look like. So proceed, but proceed with caution and responsibility is what I'm hearing from you, right, Aniket?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so kind of switching tracks a bit, right? As we speak about this industry, how this is panning out, I'm very curious to understand about folks who are probably startups or folks who are moving into this, right? Like, what kind of skills do you think is necessary to succeed in the field of generative AI? And what advice would you give for someone who's looking at starting in the space? And when I say starting in the space, again, as an investor, maybe you think more in terms of startups and entrepreneurs. So what kind of skills do you see is required, right? Which I would assume is more than technical skills. So how do you evaluate people who are in the space, and what advice would you give for those who are seeking to start up in this space?
Sure. See, I think it again depends on which aspect or which layer of the whole generative AI value chain you want to play a part in. If you want to be a part of the infra layer or want to actually work on the language models, like you correctly said, I think you need to have the right technical skills. I think therefore a
Right.
strong background in mathematics, computer science, proficiency in programming, understanding of neural networks will help you sort of create or will help you get into that space. But I think for the first time, this is technical space where you could create a lot of value even without having a technical background. I think a lot of problem solving abilities and your whole creative mindset could also help you play a large part in this chain without necessarily having a technical background. I think a new job title that has just sort of come to the foray in the recent past in this space is that of a prompt engineer. And I mean, I'm just stating this number from one of the articles I read. So this is a new prompt engineer automatically makes you think that this is an engineering job, but this is a job that can pay you up to 300 400k dollars a year without an engineering degree. And the whole idea of this job is it's not really a science. It's more of the approach is more of a let's poke the bear in different ways and see how it roars back. So
Yeah.
the idea is to know what are the right keywords to use, know what are the right languages to sort of uh, uh, input into existing models that exist and see how the model reacts and help therefore train the model better and better. So again, it requires you to have good problem solving abilities, requires you to think of potential end solutions and craft the language along the way. Again, a job like this is something that did not exist earlier, and you might think uh, hey, it's hard to even list out specifically what are the skill sets that you might require for this. But I think more jobs
Yeah.
like this will sort of come about. I think people need to start thinking of more of what the outcome they want in terms of end product, in terms of end creative output that they're looking at. And I think tools will sort of be enablers for them. And I think people who have that big large picture in mind can do well in this even uh, without a technical background. So I still think it's early days in terms of how to really make a mark into this. But I think as long as you have some idea of how some of these languages are evolving, and if you can uh, understand which are the parts where you can add value. I think there is scope for both technical and non-technical people to be some of the early entrants into the space to potentially disrupt an industry or a sector a couple of years down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great time to be alive, honestly, Aniket, right? Like, like earlier you had these clear tracks that okay, you do this subject, you become this particular role, right? Like you do medicine, you end up being a doctor. I think right now is the time where there's this confluence of different skill sets which kind of come together. I've seen people who have background in philosophy and in AI, right? There's this really nice book called Medici Effect, which talks about how genius lies at the intersection of various technology, not technologies, various sectors itself, right? Like creativity with tech, for example. So I think it's absolutely great point that way. Based on like people I've been speaking to, broadly there are like two types, right? Like one who are very worried about, oh, will this take away my jobs? A lot of them may, right? Like there's no two ways about it, right? But it's also going to amplify, like Reid Hoffman probably calls it, instead of AI, artificial intelligence, he calls it as amplified intelligence, right? So it could make your jobs better. It could augment and increase the size of the pie itself, right? So,
Correct.
and then there are those who are curious to kind of get their hands dirty, learn, try, experiment, and they are the ones who are probably going to figure out how this will evolve, right? Because there's, like you rightly called out, there's no playbook where we can say, okay, this is what is going to happen. And with respect to prompt engineering, I remember chatting with someone the other day around how this could probably be the last job before AI kind of takes that up and would probably do that itself, right? There's this marketplace I came across, Aniket, which actually does this, right? Like brings in people who would do the prompt engineering for you in terms of building a absolute world class resume, or put together prompts on mid journey to create a fashion model. So even that in itself is getting built out as marketplaces, right? So you never know how what new business models could turn up. So bottom line, stay curious, try out stuff, and be in the middle of things is what I'm hearing from you as well, right? So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
sounds like great advice. Yeah. I'm going to wrap up with one last question over here before we conclude. So again, as an investor, you're tracking the space closely. Are there serious investments in this, or is it still in the exploration phase? And again, I want to understand this from both the India perspective as well as the global scale, right? Which probably are at two different levels of maturity right now. So, what do you see as an investor?
No, I think there is serious money being poured into this. I think two indicators for this are one is actually seeing the dollar amount being invested into this space. So for instance, I think we had as little as $400 million put into what was called quote unquote generative AI back in 2018, and that number is about 4.5 to 5 billion as of 2021. So I don't know the 2022 and 2023 numbers, but I presume it's on the same lines, if not higher. I think even if I had to compare India and in outside, I mean, outside, I think we're seeing a lot of serious money being put into this. I think I came across companies that have raised upwards of 100. I mean, OpenAI itself has raised $1 billion
Yeah.
plus, but that's operating at the base layer or at the infra layer of everything else. But even at the application layer, we are seeing companies that have raised upwards of $100 million in a round, which is which is a significant boost uh, to what this technology is capable of disrupting. I think you could arguably say that it could be a fad as well, but I think money that's being pumped in at such high magnitude, the idea or more of these investments that I've seen have been to solve for a particular problem in a particular space. So take for instance, I think where I've seen a large part of the money going in, it's more so on the enterprise marketing communications side of
Mm.
things. So generating copy, generating
Yeah.
content for blogs, for articles that the
Mm.
marketing team typically has to keep doing to stay relevant in the market with its customers, with potential customers. A lot of that can be now sort of created by AI. So I think there are companies like Jasper and Copy.ai that have raised a lot of money. We spoke a
Mm.
lot about the video side of things. I think a big company outside UK based company that's raised a lot of money in this space is a company called Synthesia. I think it's raised upwards
Yeah.
of $50 million.
Yeah.
Again, they're creating video in ways that have never been created before. And I think even if you come closer to, and closer to home, which is India. We're seeing companies of this sort that are uh, disrupting the space. An Indian company called Rephrase, again in the whole video space, which is very similar to Synthesia, has raised, I can't call the exact number, but I think it's about to the tune of 10 to $15 million. They did the recent ad with Cadbury's and Shah Rukh Khan, where they where they sort of did personalized advertising. But even in the space that we operate in, which is writing smaller checks to the tune of 500K to about a million, million and a half, we're seeing a lot of companies. I spoke of the cart abandonment company some time
Right.
back, which is just solving that use case of improving cart conversion rates in an e-commerce site. But all of these companies are also raising. We spoke to a company that's just working on digital news anchors. So news companies that constantly churn out articles basis reporters that exist in different part of the country have figured that if they have a video version of that exact article, it's better for engagement. So
Right.
how do you convert a written article into video? Use a digital news anchor, where the digital
Mm.
news anchor could be an avatar of one of the popular news reporters itself, and by using facial movements and audio cloning and corrective sort of lip syncing, that person could read out the article, which could, in its best case, you could make out the difference between that and the real reporter. But even in the cases that exist today, it's better than just reading out the article. And I think if you aren't someone who can read or can't read in a particular language, uh,
Yeah.
a lot of applications of this technology exist. So I think a lot of these use cases we're seeing in India, uh,
Hmm.
where a lot of this is being created. I think even on the data side, I read an article recently that said that today, or I think 86, 87% of machine learning models don't go into production because there
Yeah.
isn't sufficient base data available for it. And if you look
Mm.
at where data is going to progress in the next 5 years or so, I think most of the data that's going to be used for a lot of these machine learning models is going to be synthetically generated data. So, for instance, today an Uber or a Google, if they're creating a self-driving car, and it has to cover all of the use cases, and the use case could be that how does the car react or stop if, let's say, a cat runs across the road at this speed. Now you may not
Mm.
have an exact data set in reality of that, but synthetically generated data can help you create those different scenarios. Again, prompt engineer could come in there to create a lot of these scenarios where you create these different use cases, create artificial data, and then train the models that will then go into production. Uh, this could help really accelerate the rate at which this technology could come into production, and we could see a lot of good use cases on that front. So yeah, I think we're seeing investment at different fronts. I
Mm.
think, and I'm sure I'm not seeing a lot of the other cool stuff that's happening as well, just because of how much people are moving forward quickly
Mm.
on this. But I think it's one of those areas where even the most what do you call it, experienced person in the space has
Yeah.
3 4 years of
Exactly.
knowledge experience
Yeah.
at best. So it's not a place where you have a detailed playbook to follow. It's a place where you could be a known name down the line, and I think that should be exciting for anyone who wants to play a part in this.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? It's almost like everyone is trying to figure out stuff, and that therefore makes it a good place for people to start off as well. Just a follow up to that one, Aniket, right? Solid use cases, all of them. But when you talk about startups in India specifically, right, we hear only like a couple of names, like we call it rephrase.ai, comes up multiple times. But I've personally had conversations where, folks have pointed out, VCs such as yourself point out that there's not a lot of startups per se from India in itself. In terms of maturity, right? So you do have all these POCs, but do you also see them with actual customers, or do you think they're still in the POC stage itself, right? Like I'm talking specifically from India as a market.
You're right. I think we see more of POC use cases. I think wherever the technology is still operating at a broad level and the company hasn't fixated on a product, a business model, way by which it will monetize it, I think we are seeing them spread wide and thin in terms of trying to attract different customers. And I think most of the revenue also that they're generating is more of service related agreements. Hey, you have this requirement, I will create this for
Right.
you, but I can't really replicate this playbook for somebody else because their requirement could be completely different.
Right. Yeah.
Which is fine for them to be nimble and agile while they are also figuring out how to raise funds.
Mm,
But yeah, I mean, I think if you look at some of the bigger companies in the US that have raised money,
mm,
some of the names that we spoke of as well,
mm,
they have eventually sort of gotten deep into one particular sector. It's very hard, in my opinion, to create a product that could span across sectors. I think
yeah.
you can only do that iteratively over a period of time. But until you get
Mm,
there, in my opinion, you need to dig deeper into one. We spoke actually into one sector. We spoke actually to a lot of these customers
mm,
that are using technology by a lot of these Indian startups in the generative AI space. And
mm,
nobody is critical of it or nobody is saying, hey, I've had a bad experience. Everybody is fascinated by it. But if I were to sort of tell them, hey, are you in a position to write a contract or a PO to
yeah.
say that I will pay you X amount month on month or year on year, at least even for a 2 year period, nobody's willing
Mm,
to do that as yet. And that to
mm,
me is indication that the they don't want to miss the bus and therefore they want to try this out, but they aren't really sure what the
right.
long term recurring use case is to continuously sort of use this. And that's something that I think the startups in India need to focus on to identify that.
That's very insightful, Aniket. Thanks a lot for doing that. Um, a great conversation, right? I think we covered a bunch of things across, but I do want to you know, get your points before we conclude. Any concluding thoughts on this topic, Aniket, before we wrap up?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think you touched upon this earlier, but I think larger society needs to also sort of ask the right questions when it comes to generative AI. I think the idea is not just understanding or not be intimidated by how generative AI works, but to try and develop that understanding of what it can do for you, your job, and your industry. Uh, Ask yourself those fundamental questions. What is it that drains you? What is it that energizes you? Are there new tools that are being developed that can take some of these tasks off of my plate? uh, where is it that I bring unique value, and where is it that I should be focusing my
Yep.
efforts? I think uh, if if you think of it from that standpoint, I think you will have a lot of tools that can enable you and that will allow you to sort of stay pertinent to however the job industry sort of evolves or progresses from here. I think being sort of afraid of being made redundant, one shouldn't worry too much about that. I mean, I think whatever 1700, 1800, when industrialization came about, it's not as though all of the farmers lost their jobs. I mean, all of them moved on to other things, right? I mean, today we are still producing more from farms than we have ever produced before, but there are far fewer people today working in farms than there have ever been in the past. So it's just that I think work will evolve. You need to find out how is it that you will tune in, how is it that you will make yourself relevant to the way the work is evolving. And I think new job, for every job that becomes redundant, I think a new job will be created. And I think with that sense of optimism, there is a lot that this technology has to offer, and I'm keen to see how that pans out.
Yeah, that's a great thought to conclude with, right? On that positive note, it reminds me of this quote: "It's the best of times, it's the worst of times, but it's exciting as well." So, thank you, Aniket. Really glad to have you here, and brilliant, brilliant thoughts and insights across. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
My pleasure, Anjani. Good to see you, and thanks for having me over.